Let's move to the first session to get to know more about salient points of AI strategy of Australia. Let's get to know more about various areas of focus and agenda for different sectors, the outlook on government and private partnership, and also how AI will shape Australia by 2030. To cover all that, I welcome Professor Toby Walsh, Laureate Fellow and Scientia Professor of AI School of Computer Science Education at University of New South Wales, Sydney, to share with us the National AI Strategy of Australia. Professor Toby Walsh.
Thank you for that warm welcome. As a means of introduction, I'm a professor of artificial intelligence, a laureate fellow at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, and a research group leader at CSIRO's Data 61. In Australia, we have a very fine tradition of acknowledging the owners of the lands upon which we meet, so I'm going to begin by paying my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the owners of the lands upon which I am sitting, and extend those respects to all owners of all the lands that you may well be on. Today, I'm going to briefly describe the national plans for artificial intelligence here in Australia and some of the interesting trends and directions that you see. And I want to paint a somewhat mixed picture that despite the successful, ongoing, responsible deployment of AI here in Australia, the government has somewhat lagged in developing its AI strategy and in funding that. And indeed, I think the message, perhaps the take-home message from this talk, is that despite the government dragging its feet, and despite the government not spending as much as other comparable governments have around the world, the AI scene here is nevertheless still very healthy. So flourishing despite the government's tardiness and government's lack of spending. Partly that's due to the fact that in Australia, we're famous for being early adopters. This is adoption of smartphones. We pretty much lead the world in the speed and percentage take-up across all age demographics of smartphones, faster than Japan, faster than the UK, faster than the United States. It's hard to find a country which has embraced technologies quicker than us. And that applies also to our scientists. We punch above our weight. There was just released a week or two ago, Web of Science released their latest report on highly cited researchers, and Australia came fourth after the United States, China, and the United Kingdom. So for a country of 25 million people, that's very respectable. And that extends down to the field of artificial intelligence itself. There's a very good website, CS Rankings, that ranks institutions, universities, by the high-profile publications in the leading AI venues for artificial intelligence. An interesting story there is that China, in the last few years, has started to dominate the rankings, and indeed, the top 10 is largely a matter of Chinese institutions. But you see that Carnegie Mellon comes in at number 6, the University of Oxford at number 8, and my own home institution, the University of New South Wales, comes in at 9. And there are many other Australian universities further down the list. And if you go to a particular other area where AI is very important, like computer vision, again, the story is one where China is somewhat dominating the league tables. But there, indeed, Australia is doing even better. We have the number 2 institution in the world, the University of Adelaide. There's some very fine machine learning colleagues doing some really good, great computer vision over in Adelaide. And if you look at not just the quantity of publications, but also the quality, if you look at, this is a graph of impact against number. So you want to be on the right-hand side of this graph, top right-hand side of the graph. right hand to the right are more publications, to the top are more impactful publications. You can see that the United States is right over at the right with many high quality publications. But Australia is doing very respectably in this chart. Indeed, the only country which is doing better for its size is Singapore. And you see that in application. We are 5 times world champion in robot soccer. We have, it's a couple of areas like robots where we're particularly successful in. And that has filtered down into industry involvement and industry engagement. There was a very high profile announcement a few days ago. Google is investing $1 billion, Australian dollars, in Australia's digital future. Indeed, it's opening Google Research and an outpost of the Google Research Labs here in Sydney. And we've had similar announcements from other tech companies. Amazon have opened a lab a couple of years ago in Adelaide, and they were joined shortly afterwards by research outposts for companies like Microsoft and Nokia. And this graph is one that amused me greatly. It's the number of job adverts in LinkedIn. It's taken from the AI 100 index report, if you want to find it, as a percentage of all job adverts. And you can see that 0.5%, this is quite a remarkable statistic, 0.5% of all job adverts now in Australia are those that are calling for some sort of AI skills, which is pretty good compared to the rest of the world. And then the final graph before I go on to those national plans, if we look at the venture capital setting, the amount of capital investment, we're 6th in the world, and per capita at least. Clearly the United States, there's more venture capital flowing around in the United States, but there are a few other countries of our size that have so much investment in the AI sector. Again, this is a graph you can find in the AI 100 report. So let me go on to the national AI plans here. And as I said, somewhat slow in being developed. Back in 2016, a number of countries started to develop their AI strategies. There was a big report out of the White House on AI. We saw the French AI strategy launched with €1 billion being announced then. Many of us, myself included, started to take notice, started to lobby. Early in 2017, I started to lobby parts of government here that we really ought to be thinking about this ourselves. That lobbying was eventually successful. And in 2018, I was invited by the chief scientist of Australia on behalf of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet to provide a report to identify the opportunities, the challenges that the government should be considering in building its AI strategy. The Australian government has a very principled mechanism. It's called a horizon scanning report. It gets members of the learned academies like myself to look at these emerging technologies and to make recommendations, evidence-based recommendations to government as to what government should be responding to in terms of funding and policy and regulation. So we very quickly, in 6 months, produced a report similar to the reports that you've seen come out of France, come out of the UK, making a bunch of recommendations, which I'll come to. Unfortunately, the national election, got in the way as the report was finished, and so we had to wait 6 months for the report to be published. So the report didn't come out till July 2019. And the report makes a number of important recommendations, many of which you now see reflected in policy that's been adopted by the government. So I'm going to go, there's 6 key recommendations in the report. And the most important and I think distinguishing characteristic of the report is it identified that this wasn't just an economic opportunity. There, of course, is a significant economic opportunity to use AI, but it's a major opportunity to improve our environment, to improve our society, to improve quality of our democratic debate, to improve our well-being in all aspects of it. In saying that, they're not without challenges, and the report points out that earning public trust is going to be critical, and that we've only seen those concerns amplify since 2018 when we put out that finding. It also recommended that strong governance and a responsive regulatory system was necessary, and we've seen necessity for that only increase. Indeed, we've seen various forms of governance start to be applied, especially within Europe, but even so, a small amount here within Australia. The report points out that data is, of course, central to much of the use of AI these days, and points out that, of course, government is the body that has some of the most data, or collects certainly the most data about citizens within the country, and is actually trusted in many respects with that data more than anything. We have a National Health Service here, so we have some very good sources of data that we could use for very positive ends. The fifth recommendation is that there's an important need to invest in skills to use AI, and I'll come to that, how the government's responded to that recommendation in a second, and also for the workforce more broadly to respond and adapt, so that as jobs get displaced by technologies like AI, that those people find new jobs with the new skills that they have picked up. And finally, we made a recommendation for an independent AI body to guide and advise and provide a critical mass of expertise along the lines of something like the Turing Institute you see in the UK. Again, you'll see the government's response to that on the next slide. In terms of money, there was a small response a year later in 2020 budget. There was $30 million announced. But the primary response came again a year later in 2021. As I did say, the government has been somewhat slow to pick up the baton here. So it wasn't to the government, the budget, in April time this year, that the government made a significant announcement. It put forward an AI action plan and announced spending of $124 million. That's a significant sum of money, but nevertheless somewhat disappointing given the billions of dollars you see being announced in places like France, Germany, United Kingdom, South Korea, the $500 million even that India has announced. And that's split over a number of initiatives, things like a national AI center, as we suggested in our sixth recommendation, and small business grants, investing in the regions, and $24 million to bring onto stream next generation AI graduates and postgraduates. And certainly a criticism that's been made recently is that that money is being spent very slowly. Very little of that money has yet to be spent. So whilst we have an action plan, unfortunately other things like the pandemic have rather distracted the government of the day in terms of implementing that action plan and in terms of spending that money. I mentioned my title of the talk was AI plans, and we shouldn't consider just that fiscal plan in terms of spending money. There's other things the government has been doing, has developed, and is now significantly more mature. At the same time as the Horizon Scanning report came out, we produced a framework, a voluntary framework for the responsible development of artificial intelligence. There are 8 ethical principles here. There's no great surprises about improving well-being, a human-centered focus to it, with respect to fairness, privacy, reliability, transparency, explainability, accountability. So things that you'll find in ethics frameworks being proposed by other governments around the world. The one thing I have highlighted there, because I haven't seen that in many other ethics frameworks, was putting contestability, making it important that citizens be able to contest decisions that are made about them using AI. And also, alongside that voluntary framework, there has been a number of policy recommendations that have come through the Australian Human Rights Commission. The Human Rights Commission has had a major study over the last 3 years. I was part of that study, looking at the impacts of new technologies like AI on human rights. And its final report came out very recently, earlier this year, that argues that we should put human rights at the center of how we adopt technologies like AI, and makes a number of recommendations that hopefully government is going to be picking up as it does look in the future, making sure that any AI system in both the public or the private sector have a human rights assessment, give citizens the right to be notified when AI is used to make decisions about them and to be able to contest those, to be able to demand a right for an explanation. We put forward a moratorium on the use of biometrics like face recognition, at least until there's appropriate regulation and safeguards put in place to protect citizens. And perhaps the one most novel thing that was put forward by the Human Rights Commissioner was that we perhaps should have an independent AI safety commissioner to provide expertise and oversight to the deployment of AI, both by government and by the private sector. And then I want to mention one final, very recent development, just a week or so ago, which was the government made a significant policy announcement. And this is, I think, something we see not just within Australia, but we also see it, a trend, a growing trend elsewhere, which is a focus on sovereign capability, especially amongst critical technologies. And the government announced a major policy about protecting and promoting half a dozen or so of critical technologies. Those critical technologies include artificial intelligence. They include a bunch of things where AI is closely connected, like autonomous vehicles, both land, air, and sea. In the cybersecurity, again, AI is going to play a significant role in cybersecurity, both in offense and defense. In quantum, again, quantum is going to play a significant role in perhaps how we develop AI. In a bunch of other areas that are of significance and strategic importance to Australia, like critical minerals, genomics, and something very topical like vaccines. It's still not yet very clear exactly how the government is going to take the principles about promoting and protecting sovereign capability in these critical technologies. We've yet to see how that's going to be substantiated, but the government has made a very clear policy statement that this is going to be a significant component in their decision-making and in policy moving forward. And so we certainly can expect to see future developments along these lines. So that's the story of the AI plans within Australia. As I said, I think the take home is that despite the government's somewhat tiredness, despite the government's not spending huge amounts of money, Australia is nevertheless punching well above its weight, and we're seeing significant investment. We're seeing significant progress being made in the responsible deployment of AI. And I would encourage you, if you'd like to know more, I have written 2 books for a more general audience. The first, It's Alive, which is more about the technology. And the second, which is more about the impact that that technology is going to have on our society, 2062, the world that AI made. So I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Toby, for that informative session. I'm sure Australia is surging ahead in the field of AI with the help of various policies and guidelines, and of course, AI-driven projects that have material impact. For AI to be a positive force for humanity, it needs to include and inspire our most special audience, our youth.